Greetings. My name is Laura Heisler, and I am the director of Hello, I'm Laura Heisler. I'm Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. I'm also the co-founder and director of the Wisconsin Science Festival, and I'm here as part of the Badger Talks Live focus on this month's Wisconsin Science Festival. I'll be back next week with festival co-founder George Sugros, and we are going to give you a step-by-step and behind-the-scenes tour of how you can experience this month's festival, which begins October 21st and runs through the 24th. And next week, we are going to help you find your way to more than nearly 300 different events in 100 venues around the state, and we'll show you how you can participate, whether you want to go to something in person, do something outside on your own, or watch something from the comfort of your home. This week, what we want to do is give you some insights into one of our longest running partnerships, which is, of course, with the Wisconsin Book Festival. That runs concurrent with the Science Festival. Our two festivals have been partnering for nearly 8 years to bring you the very best in new books from authors nationally and from Wisconsin authors that focus on a number of topics. We partner, of course, on the science books, but the Wisconsin Book Festival has dozens of talks from authors from all over the country, all over the world, and Wisconsin, ranging on topics, all topics, current topics in the news, fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and more. The Wisconsin Book Festival is a production of Madison Public Libraries and Madison Public Library Foundation. All events are free. Many events are in person, and many events are live streamed and available also after the fact as recording. So I want to encourage you to check out the book festival. We're going to be hearing from there are a record number of UW-Madison authors being featured at our two festivals this year. We're going to be hearing from two of them a little bit later in just a couple of minutes. Before I turn things over to the person who will introduce today's speakers, though, I do want to make you aware of one more event. And if you like what you hear today, you might want to attend a new series that begins tonight, live in person at the Discovery Building on the UW-Madison campus, but it's also going to be live streamed all over Wisconsin and recorded. So if you're interested, if you like what you hear today and you want to know more about how philosophy can impact our lives and how we interface with science and really weighty issues, you might want to check out the Crossroads of Ideas series, which again is tonight. You can find out about it if you go to wharf.org/crossroads. We are tackling some really big questions. In fact, we're calling it Big Questions. And we have 5 different Big Questions talks throughout the rest of this academic year, starting tonight with the very biggest of all, what is life? So if you're interested in what you hear today, come and check this out as well. And with that, it is my pleasure to turn our focus to today's topic. We'll be hearing from these two gentlemen at the Wisconsin Science Festival / Book Festival on October 23rd. And to tell us a little bit more about these authors and researchers and philosophers and their book, I'm delighted to turn things over to Ph.D. student in philosophy at UW-Madison, Elise Watley. Elise, over to you.
Thanks so much, Laura. Greetings, everyone. My name is Elise Watley. I'm originally from Houston, Texas. But as Laura said, I'm currently a PhD student in the Department of Philosophy with an emphasis in philosophy of mind and cognitive science. I'm pleased to introduce professors of philosophy Larry Shapiro and Steve Nadler. Today, they will be sharing thoughts from their book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and presenting their argument that the best antidote for the current epidemic of bad thinking is the wisdom, insights, and practical skills of philosophy. Larry Shapiro is the Barrett Inch Professor of Philosophy, and received his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. His areas of research include the philosophy of mind and psychology, and recently the philosophy of the philosophy of religion. He has written multiple books and published articles in many philosophy journals on the topics above, as well as computational theories of vision, evolutionary psychology, and embodied cognition. His book, titled Embodied Cognition, was awarded the American Philosophical Association's Joseph B. Gittler Award for Best Book in Philosophy of the Social Sciences. Steve Nadler is the Vilas Research Professor and William H. Hay II Professor of Philosophy. He received his PhD from Columbia University and focuses on early modern philosophy, moral philosophy, as well as Jewish philosophy. He's published many books and articles on these topics and was the founding director of the UW Center for Humanities, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and recently elected a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He currently serves as the director of UW-Madison's Institute for Research in the Humanities. Please welcome Larry Shapiro and Steve Nadler.
Thank you, Elise, and thanks to Laura and the Crossroads of Ideas program and the Wisconsin Book Festival for highlighting our book today.
Yes, thanks very much.
I'd like to start off by saying that neither of us ever envisioned writing a book like this before. One of us, Larry, is a philosopher of mind, interested in the nature of mental events and philosophical issues around psychology and cognitive science. I'm a scholar of early modern philosophy, and I work on such 17th century thinkers as Descartes and Spinoza. However, we're both trained as philosophers, and it is as philosophers that we watch events in our community and our state, our country, and around the world with great concern, even alarm and fear. There is, of course, the global COVID-19 pandemic that is costing so many lives and taking an enormous economic toll. But what's equally and perhaps even more worrisome is another pandemic. It's a pandemic that, while not as visible as the current medical crisis, not only exacerbates its tragic effects, but wreaks havoc on a more extensive basis. We're talking about a pandemic of irrationality, or what we in our book call bad thinking.
Within our field of philosophy, the term epistemology refers to the study of knowledge. A philosopher concerned with epistemology seeks a theory of rationality. Such a theory will explain why some beliefs are justified and some not, as well as why some true beliefs qualify as knowledge, but others do not. Although many issues within epistemology have become too abstract and technical for the non-specialist, nearly every person can appreciate the importance of evidence in justifying a belief. We all can or should acknowledge that tea leaves or fortune cookies are bad reasons to believe something, whereas firsthand experience, rigorous experimentation, or the testimony of experts are good reasons. The epistemically stubborn person refuses to tailor his or her beliefs to the available evidence. They continue to believe, for instance, that the COVID-19 vaccine is dangerous, despite the wealth of evidence to the contrary. Typically, the fault is not ignorance of the facts. One would have to be living in a deep hole not to have been exposed to widespread reports of the coronavirus's danger and the vaccine's efficacy and safety. Rather, the problem is a stubborn refusal to see the facts as repudiating what one wants to believe. Epistemic stubbornness is its own kind of disease, and arguably even more dangerous than COVID-19. Yes, COVID-19 has, in all too many cases, been lethal, but epistemic stubbornness is the force driving a resistance to the very vaccines that would have prevented these deaths. In fact, epistemic stubbornness manifests itself across a broad spectrum of issues of the utmost importance. Here in the United States, we see epistemic stubbornness lying behind persistent but patently absurd claims that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. It's beyond doubt that the most recent presidential election was fair and that Trump lost. Justification for believing that Biden won the presidency fair and square is overwhelming. Those who deny this outcome are, like those opposed to the COVID-19 vaccine, probably not dumb or stupid. Rather, they're irrational in that, badly misled by cynical and self-serving politicians and pundits, they simply refuse to believe a conclusion to which the evidence so clearly points. They're governed not by reason, but by desire or passion. They simply want to believe that Trump won the election, and it's that desire, rather than evidence, that forms the basis of their belief. We see the same kind of epistemic stubbornness in the denial of climate change. Can the research data and many computer models that show the effect of fossil fuels on climate be mistaken? Can reports of melting glaciers, rising sea levels, increasingly violent storms, and extraordinarily hot temperatures all be a hoax? Epistemically stubborn people can be very creative in devising stories that deny the evidence. This is just another symptom of their disease. They settle on a proposition they want to believe, and refuse to accept evidence to its contrary? Can it be a coincidence that climate change denial is stronger among those who live in states that produce oil or coal? Familiarity with some basic philosophical concepts offers one possible treatment for epistemic stubbornness. A deeper understanding of why some beliefs are justified and some not, or why some beliefs, even true ones, might nevertheless fall short of knowledge, allows one to reflect more carefully on whether one should believe something. Perhaps even more usefully, a background in basic epistemology equips one to challenge others when you see that their beliefs lack proper support. Developing a theory of justification, knowledge, and their relationship is the main business of epistemology. To justify a belief, you must provide reasons for thinking that it's true. Being justified, however, is not the same as being true. A belief might be true, but unjustified. Suppose, for instance, you correctly believe that on this date, 100 years from now, it will be raining. Surely in this case, it's hard to imagine how one could be truly justified in a belief about a meteorological event so far in the future. Your belief happens to be true, though, despite being unjustified. Likewise, some false beliefs might enjoy tremendous justification. Just think, for example, of Newton's physics. For centuries, Newton's ideas about force and mass seemed so well confirmed that no one in their right mind could think that they were false. Yet we now know, with Einstein's help, that they are. Your belief at the very start of the 20th century that force is the product of mass and acceleration was justified, even though we now know it's false. Likewise, before Galileo's discoveries of the phases of Venus, the moons of Jupiter, and other astronomical phenomena in the early 17th century, what would have been justified in believing that the sun and the other planets and stars revolved around the earth? Knowledge, as epistemologists understand the concept, is something like the sum of truth and justification. One can never know something that's false, nor can you claim to know something, even something true, without having justification for your belief. But we can put aside these somewhat abstract ruminations on concepts like justification and knowledge and focus on some real practical benefits that have emerged from the millennia that philosophers have spent thinking about them. As we try to understand how to be rational, how to ensure that one's beliefs are properly justified and most probably true, philosophers have sought to establish rules of good thinking. When lay people talk about arguments, they typically have in mind unpleasant confrontations. Philosophers, on the other hand, think of arguments as strategies for justifying a belief, almost like soccer coaches might think of set plays as strategies for scoring, or doctors might think of treatment plans as strategies for curing. And just as the good coach will recognize when the circumstances are right for this play, and the good doctor will understand when this rather than that treatment is appropriate, the good reasoner will appreciate when one kind of argument rather than another serves to justify a particular belief.
The consequences of irrationality and bad thinking are not limited to what we happen to believe. What we believe and why we believe it matters greatly in a very practical way, insofar as our actions are typically driven by our beliefs. Epistemic stubbornness is often accompanied by a kind of normative stubbornness. What we mean by this is that we all too often act without sufficient reflection on what we are doing and why we are doing it. This is especially apparent when it comes to exercising authority and applying rules. Here are a couple of examples. In a high school in Madison, Wisconsin, a black security guard is dealing with a disruptive student who is also black. While being led away by the guard, the student is repeatedly calling him a racial slur. The guard tells the student several times, "Do not call me a N-word," using the actual word. The school district, however, has a zero tolerance, one strike and you're out policy governing the use of that offensive word. It is a well-intentioned policy instituted to ensure a safe and respectful learning environment for a diverse body of students. Unfortunately, it's also a policy that the security guard appears purely as a technicality to have violated, and he is summarily fired by the principal. After a public outcry, the guard is later reinstated. Second example. At a cross-country meet in Ohio, a 16-year-old Muslim woman is disqualified for wearing a hijab during the race. She attends a private Muslim school but participates in athletics for the local public high school. Because her coach neglected to fill out before the race the proper paperwork for a religious clothing waiver, which she would have received as a matter of course, she is told by the race directors after the race that her headwear, which, though made by Nike, brings her no competitive advantage, nonetheless violates regulations governing athletic uniforms. She's disqualified, but she had run her personal best time in the race. What we see in both of these cases is an overzealous, even thoughtless application of a rule. This normative stubbornness, as a kind of autopilot rule following, leads to what any reasonable person should regard as wrong-headed and even unjust treatment. The problem is that the rule enforcers are not thinking hard enough about what they are doing, and therefore they are acting unreasonably. What all such situations call for is not just a recognition that a particular rule applies to a particular set of circumstances, but something more: good judgment. Judgment is a matter of discretion. A discreet person knows when and when not to say or do something. She is good at assessing an individual or situation and determining what is called for in word and deed. By contrast, an indiscreet person will typically say or do the wrong thing, something inappropriate or offensive. Judgment in the moral sphere, where it involves action, is a matter of reasonable discrimination. A person with good judgment recognizes both what is typical and what is distinctive about the particular case at hand, and then notes whether what is distinctive is relevant. The teenage runner was indeed wearing a hijab for which her coach forgot to seek a waiver. What mattered was not the headscarf's brand or color or religious significance, but whether it gave her a competitive advantage, which it did not. Circumstances are everything. The police officer who declines to give a speeding ticket to a driver on his way to the hospital because his wife is in labor in the back seat is making a judgment call. Exercising judgment differs from either ignoring the rule or overlooking the facts and, in effect, turning the other way. When we turn the other way, we are essentially refusing to make a judgment one way or the other, and thereby abdicating responsibility. By contrast, judgment involves acknowledging that the rule has been broken, that the perpetrating party is technically guilty, but also making a conscious and deliberate choice not to enforce the rule. Just as important, and unlike turning the other way, you must be prepared, if challenged, to defend that choice with reasons. It is to recognize that the full application of the rule would result in an unjust, or at least undesirable, state of affairs. Knowing when a belief is justified and when it is not, tailoring your beliefs to the available and appropriate evidence, not holding on to a belief when it is clearly refuted by the facts, this is what it means to be epistemically rational. Exercising discretion in our actions, knowing what we are doing and why we are doing it, acting on our very best judgment. This is what it means to be practically or normatively rational. What it all comes down to is something that Socrates insisted on nearly 2.5 millennia ago. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates insists that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. Socrates' idea of an unexamined life might seem easy enough to describe in a general way. It's the life of someone who never seriously questions things, least of all his or her own actions and plans. Such a person might indeed ask whether their actions or those of their friends or community or government are expedient or popular or even pleasant, but they do not or only rarely ask whether these actions are in fact good. The unexamined life is a life of moral and intellectual passivity. But what exactly is demanded in an examined life? At the very least, it requires a careful examination of one's action in the light of one's values and principles. You need to ask whether, given what you believe about right and wrong and good and bad, you need to ask whether what you are doing is the right thing or what you are pursuing is a good thing. You need to engage in reflection on the moral character of your actions. But all of that's only one stage of the examined life. Even more important is a second stage, where you engage in reflection on and examination and testing of those values and principles themselves. This is where you ask, are my beliefs about what is right and good true and justified? Do I truly know what is right and what is good? Or on the contrary, am I acting only on guesswork, a hunch, or some faith in what someone else might have told me or done? This kind of reflection and assessment of your moral thinking itself is crucial in the process of self-examination. And this brings us back to rationality and good thinking. For the most important part of the examined life is having knowledge of what you know and what you do not know. The opposite of epistemic stubbornness is epistemic humility. By this, we do not mean an undervaluation of yourself and your epistemic condition. It does not mean any kind of self-deprecation. Rather, epistemic humility means taking an accurate assessment of where you stand, taking stock of your beliefs to see which are truly justified, and not thinking that you know what you do not really know.
We open our book with a diagnosis of a serious problem, one that threatens our health, but also the fabric of our society and even the existence of life on our planet. We'd like to close this presentation, as we close the book, with a prescription. What can we do to cure bad thinking in its various manifestations, as epistemic and normative stubbornness? A good first step in dealing with irrationality in thought and action is simply to acknowledge its existence and its distinctness from other deficiencies like ignorance and stupidity. There is, after all, no easy cure for stupidity. As philosophers and academics, we place our hope in education. Instruction in philosophy, and the earlier one is exposed to it, the better, can only deepen one's understanding of how reasoning works, how good evidence differs from bad, how premises support a conclusion, and how to form and maintain or give up beliefs in a rational manner. Philosophers have long been devoted to cataloging and examining a variety of argument forms. What are good and valid ways to argue for something, for the truth of some thesis, and what are bad, invalid, or fallacious ways? These efforts are not undertaken merely as an intellectual exercise, a pursuit of pleasure of the kind that a challenging Sudoku game might deliver. Philosophers understand that rational belief that rests on a solid ground of justification, is our best hope for living good, comfortable, healthy lives in a healthy environment. The discoveries that have improved our lives, and not just things like medicines and technologies, but also ideas about sound governance, justice, and civil rights, grew from arguments of just the sort that philosophical training prepares one to evaluate. This brings us to our next point. Apart from its focus on reasons, justification, and rationality, philosophy imparts a different kind of wisdom as well. We can learn from philosophy what it means to live an examined life, a life in which one takes the trouble to discover what one really does and does not know, a life of epistemic humility that reflects values that lead not just to personal fulfillment and equanimity, rather than resentment and hatred, but to reasonable approaches to social, political, and environmental problems.
Although we have been emphasizing the role that philosophy might play in curbing epistemic stubbornness, we would be remiss in not recognizing the importance of the humanities more generally in teaching young minds how to think critically. At a recent gathering of parents of incoming students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one parent asked how, given the cost of tuition, she could possibly justify her daughter taking classes in ancient Greek or modern art or medieval philosophy or other quote-unquote frivolous subjects, rather than courses that will directly help her in her career goals. The easy reply to that parent is this: if you are paying that much money in tuition, you better hope that your daughter or son is taking such humanities courses, and science courses, and arts courses. After all, you're sending her to a major university, not a technical college or vocational school. How, in fact, could you justify spending the money to send her here and not have her take advantage of everything the university has to offer? This parent's underappreciation of the value of the humanities in her student's education may seem relatively harmless. After all, the student was going to take what she wanted to take, no matter what, or perhaps in spite of what her parents wanted. But in fact, it reflects a larger, very public distrust of, and even onslaught against, the humanities on our campuses. Universities and colleges are cutting back humanities departments, either by consolidating them, dropping majors, or eliminating departments altogether. To take our own discipline, philosophy, Ithaca College, Guilford College, Western Oregon University, Cabrini College, Southwest Baptist University, Rockford University, among other schools, have all eliminated their philosophy majors. Claremont Graduate University closed its philosophy department. The discipline is currently under threat elsewhere, including Ohio University, the State University of New York in Fredonia, Mills College, Missouri Western, and St. Cloud State. The list seems to grow weekly.
The defense of the humanities typically takes the form of an appeal to the way in which its disciplines, quote-unquote, mold young minds or foster critical thinking and make for enlightened citizenship. Platitudes, one and all, but no less true for their generality. And when we consider what exactly it is that students acquire in their humanities courses, an ability to make sense of texts, events, and works of creativity, the skill to communicate their thoughts in a clear and compelling manner, an informed and analytical understanding of our historical, political, economic, and ecological situation, it's not difficult to see just how philosophy, history, literary and cultural studies, and art history contribute to preparing young people for being intelligent and responsible citizens. But the danger of cutting back on the humanities must be even clearer in light of events over the past 2 years. Again, consider that even the most elementary philosophy course teaches how to tell a valid argument from an invalid one, how to evaluate a theory or proposition in relation to the available evidence, how not to fall for mistaken analogies, in short, how to avoid bad thinking. What could be more valuable at a time when people believe the craziest things, that vaccines cause autism, that 5G networks are the source of the COVID pandemic, that our most recent presidential election was stolen, that one of our political parties is under the control of a cabal engaged in human trafficking and a child sex ring? No one leading an examined life could possibly believe that the Holocaust never occurred, or that President Joseph Biden won the election through deep state manipulation and massive voter fraud. A person educated in the basic lessons of philosophy, history, and other humanistic disciplines would recognize the value of getting vaccinated against the COVID-19 virus for their own health and the health of others, and even for our national economic and political well-being. What we should be asking then is not how a student today can justify taking courses in philosophy or classics or art history or Russian literature. Rather, the real question is, how can an institution of higher education justify calling itself a university or liberal arts college if it's going to gut its humanities offerings? If the goal of undergraduate education is to create better thinkers, make students more skeptical, more capacious, in short, more wise, then our legislatures and boards of regents and trustees should be concerned with strengthening the humanities, not killing them. Thank you for listening to us describe our book.
Larry and Steve, thanks so much for sharing that information. Hello, everybody. Fran Paleo-Moyer, Badger Talks producer. I just want to clarify also the title of your book is When Bad Thinking Happens to Good People, right? Not When Bad Things Happen to Good People, as we've been referencing through the conversation. I just wanted to clarify that to begin with. Feel free to post your questions in the chat. One question for you. So when we think about the legal system, and I'm referencing back, Steve, to your part of the discussion, talking about defending with reasons and judgment. What about setting a precedent? And that's something, at least in business, I've learned, like if you're setting a precedent, how do you defend exercising good judgment, balancing with setting a precedent?
That's a great question. And we always have to remember that sometimes the person making the judgment is not really free to exercise judgment. For example, a clerk in a store who asks somebody who's clearly well over the minimum age for buying alcohol, let's say a 75-year-old person, for their ID, this person may simply be afraid of losing their job if they don't follow the rules. But in many cases, precedents are just that. They're precedents. They're not ironclad rules or laws. I mean, in some cases they are, I suppose, in the strictly legal context. But precedents still require judgment. And you have to decide whether the precedent applies in this case. And if it does, should it nonetheless be exercised? For example, there's a precedent for giving speeding tickets to people who are going over the speed limit. But when you consider all the relevant circumstances, it may be that a good judgment requires you, in fact, in this case, not to give the speeding ticket.
Good point. Thank you. So we're in a world of social media now. And how is social media impacting people's goal to live life? Even if you want to live an examined life, how is social media, and especially with our youth now, where it's such an embedded part of our culture, how is that impacting that?
I think it's pretty clear that social media is having a deleterious effect on informing people with the kinds of information that they need in order to make the good sorts of decisions. So it's no coincidence, I think, that we have something like the insurrection on January 6th, and at the same time we have things like Facebook and WhatsApp spreading all sorts of false information about fraud in the election. I think social media today is posing one of the direst threats to our society that we've faced for a very long time.
I would add that social media encourages a kind of flattening out of all sources of information, and people are now bombarded with exponentially more information than in the past, and have a good deal of trouble discriminating good information from bad, or good sources from bad sources.
You're getting lots of thumbs up in the chat. I just wanted to mention on that comment. Karen Hart posts, "You're preaching to the choir. It's clear the lack of critical thinking skills has serious ramifications. Additionally, knowledge of the humanities gives us a less dystopian view of the world and human abilities and potential." Thanks for sharing that, Karen. Can you tell us who you're envisioning as the audience for this book? And are you thinking that they'll be reading it?
That's a great question. I think we're not overly optimistic that perhaps the people who most need to read the book are going to read it. But still, we can be hopeful. We can be optimists. But ideally, educated readers out there all know people who are in the grips of bad thinking. And perhaps this book will help them guide others towards a more rational life. That it's not a how-to book, but it does, we hope, inspire people to start conversations with others, and especially those who they are in the grip of superstition or crazy ideas, to at least open their minds and consider why they believe what they believe.
Thank you. We have a question from Elizabeth Timmons. Holy cow, excellent talk. Do you think this is just a USA problem or a global problem?
This is certainly a global problem. Steve and I, because we're kind of immersed in American culture, American politics, are more attuned to the sorts of things going on in this country. But you look at the rise of the far right in countries like Germany and Hungary, and you look at COVID skepticism in countries like England. This is widespread, and this, I think, takes us back, Fran, to one of your earlier questions about social media. I think anywhere where we see the growth of social media, we're going to see these the creation of these sorts of echo chambers that encourage the kind of bad thinking that Steve and I are deploring in our book.
We have a listener who's posted a question who maybe has some questions about a parent's underappreciation of the humanities. So she was taken aback by that comment, and she said, please take a look at Amanda Ripley's high conflict and consider how setting up a good bad thinking paradigm just feeds the problems we're living with today. Any thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I mean, bad thinking is, we don't mean that as a kind of schoolyard epithet. We don't want to insult people, but there is an epidemic of irrationality. And we certainly don't want to create an us versus them. We're all in this together. If the boat goes down, we're all on the boat. And so we hope that the conversations that this book generates are constructive and don't simply increase the partisan or ideological divisions that are really bringing our democracy into a very dangerous place.
Thank you for that. And obviously your book is a great resource for everyone, and we hope people will take a gander at it. Any other resources out there? I know that people are looking for stuff online, kind of quick fix things. So not necessarily looking for quick fix, but are there any online resources or anything you could recommend to people who would really like to try to improve in this area?
One thing that Steve and I are convinced of is the importance of the discipline of philosophy in training people to avoid the kinds of errors in thought and action that we've been talking about. And there are a number of introduction to philosophy books that will take you through the basics of epistemology, of how to reason well, and will also deal with the sorts of issues that we talked about with the examined life, the kinds of moral principles that one ought to be thinking about, and how to think about formulating your own ideas about particular decisions or actions that you might be taking. So I would recommend some good intro to philosophy books. So there's one by Simon Blackburn that I think is quite good, and maybe Steve has some others in mind as well.
So I'll be the curmudgeon and quasi-Luddite here. And going back to Fran's earlier question about social media, I would say read, as Larry said, read the books, both contemporary works. Blackburn's book is titled Think, and it's quite good. And he has a companion book on ethics, or I think it's called Right and Wrong. But go back and read the classics. Read Plato's dialogues involving Socrates and see what an examined life as really beautifully portrayed is. Read Spinoza, one of the most radical and important thinkers in the history of philosophy, who really courageously questioned the dogmas of society. There's no better way to becoming a good philosopher than to read philosophy as it's done.
Great, thank you. And we have a final comment here from a viewer, Linda Scallon, saying this topic is important for saving our democracy. Thank you. And I'd like to also reiterate that. Thanks for your work in this area, and just really know that we appreciate everything that you're contributing in terms of getting people thinking about these things. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having us on Badger Talks.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Super. Well, everybody, please join us again next Tuesday. We're going to be wrapping up our tribute to the Wisconsin Science Festival, which is coming up October 21 to 24. We're going to be talking next Tuesday at noon to co-founders of the Science Festival, George Sugross and Laura Heisler, and they're going to be giving us an insider's guide to the festival with events all around the state and virtually find out the best way that you can participate. Also visit wisconsinsciencefest.org for more info. Please visit badgertalks.wisc.edu, also our website, where you can see the upcoming episode of the podcast launched today about the Wisconsin Science Festival. See our upcoming list of Badger Talks live events, as well as hosted events that are taking place around the state. Sign up for our email list and search our roster of over 400 faculty and staff who've generously signed up to give talks around the state in communities like yours on issues that are important to you. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next Tuesday.